a grave that never froze, and a man who discovered the unthinkable. Watch till the end to see the shocking truth. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. The wind cut through Green Hill Cemetery like a knife, carrying with it the icy bite of late January. Snow blanketed the rows of graves in thick, undisturbed white, muffling every sound. The iron gates creaked in the wind, and the skeletal branches of old oaks bent under the weight of frost. For Marcus Johnson, the longtime groundskeeper, this was routine. He had walked these paths for nearly 2 decades, shovel in hand, trimming, shoveling, and repairing what no one else ever cared about. Marcus was used to the cold, used to the silence of the dead. But that morning, something made him stop in his tracks. Row after row of tombstones gleamed pale with snow, except one. A single grave, about 20 feet ahead, looked strangely out of place. The headstone, tall and gray, stood bare, not a flake of snow on its polished surface. The grass surrounding it shone green, as if summer had crawled up through the frozen soil while everything else lay lifeless under winter's weight. Marcus frowned, his breath clouding the air. He took a step closer, boots crunching in the snow. The sight made his chest tighten. This wasn't right. He had cleared snow off plenty of graves before, but no one had touched this one. No shovel marks, no footprints, just untouched, vivid green in the middle of a graveyard drowned in white. His instincts whispered that something was wrong. Still, he crouched low and extended his gloved hand. The granite felt warm. Not just lukewarm, but radiating a heat that seeped through his thick glove. Marcus jerked his hand back, staring in disbelief. His eyes darted around, searching for an explanation. A prank? Some kind of heating trick? But who would bother, and why here? He pressed his palm against the stone again, this time with his bare hand. The heat shocked him. The stone almost burned against his cold skin, like it had been sitting in the sun all day. Yet the sun hadn't shown its face in a week, and the air was bitter enough to freeze water solid. Marcus pulled back, heart pounding. His thoughts ran wild. He had heard rumors about haunted plots, about graves that moved or moaned in the night, but he had never given superstition any weight. Yet now, standing in the lonely hush of Green Hill Cemetery, it was hard not to imagine something unnatural sleeping below. The wind whipped harder, scattering dry snow over his boots. Marcus forced himself to breathe slowly, steadying his nerves. He looked at the name etched into the granite. Daniel Moore, 1954, 2018. Just an ordinary man, as far as Marcus could remember. Nothing special, nothing notorious. The family had moved out of town years ago. So why was his grave the only one alive in the dead of winter? Marcus stood, rubbing his arms. The warmth still clung to his skin, almost unnerving. He tried to shake the feeling, but unease crawled deeper into him with every passing second. He was no stranger to death. He had buried more people than he cared to count. But this was different. This was alive. The longer he stared, the more he felt watched. The tombstone almost seemed to hum, though the sound might have been the wind. He turned away, taking several steps back, his breath quick and shallow. "No," he muttered under his breath, trying to calm himself. "Don't get carried away." But his instincts refused to quiet. He knew the cemetery better than anyone else in town. He knew which trees bent first in a storm, which graves flooded after heavy rain, which headstones tilted with time. And he knew, beyond any doubt, that nothing about this grave was natural. Marcus lingered for several more minutes, unable to walk away. He kept glancing over his shoulder as though the stone might follow him, as though the earth might crack open beneath his boots. Finally, with the sky dimming and snow beginning to fall again, He pulled his coat tight and turned toward the shed near the gate. That night, Marcus lay awake in his small house on the edge of town. The warmth of that stone wouldn't leave his mind. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the green grass glowing against the snow like an open wound in winter's skin. He thought of the heat burning through his glove, the way it pulsed, alive. He whispered into the dark, "This isn't real. It can't be." But deep down, he knew it was. Something beneath that grave was wrong, something powerful enough to fight the cold of winter. Marcus rolled over, staring at the ceiling. Tomorrow, he would bring the old thermal camera from the maintenance shed. He had used it before to find leaks in the irrigation lines. If the heat was natural, the camera would explain it. But if it wasn't, he didn't know what he would find. Still, he had to look. As the wind howled outside and snow piled against his window, Marcus closed his eyes, the image of the glowing grave carved into his mind. The last thought before sleep took him was a chilling one. If the dead don't stay cold, what are they hiding? The next morning broke the way January often does in the Midwest. Flat light, a pale sky that couldn't decide whether to snow again, and a cold that seemed to thread itself through seams and zippers and into the bones. Marcus arrived early, before the grounds crew truck pulled in, before the first pair of boot prints creased the new crust of frost. He unlocked the maintenance shed with stiff fingers and stepped into the familiar smell of gasoline, fertilizer, oil, and old wood. On the back shelf, beneath a coil of faded extension cables, sat the thermal camera, a battered orange handheld unit with a black rubber eye cup and a cracked screen protector. He had used it to find a busted irrigation line 2 summers ago, following a skinny vein of cold through the soil until it led him to a ruptured joint. He wiped dust from the display with the edge of his sleeve, pressed the power button, and waited for the screen to glow. The device hummed faintly to life. "Come on," he murmured, as if coaxing a skittish animal. The battery indicator blinked at half. Not great, but enough. Outside, wind skimmed over the headstones and sent a ripple through the cedars along the fence. Marcus walked the path he knew by muscle memory, past the Nichols family plot, past the white marble angel whose left wing had chipped in a storm, past the row of veterans where he always paused out of respect. Ahead, he could already make out the wrongness. A single grave with a trimmed green halo in a field of brittle frost. He slowed. The sight was no easier in daylight. It was worse, in fact, like the ground had decided to choose its season regardless of the sky. He lifted the thermal camera, thumbed the palette button from iron bow to rainbow, and framed the headstone in the viewfinder. The screen burst into color. Blues and purples marked the air and snow, but the stone itself burned a violent yellow that bled into orange, then red at the base where it met the earth. Beneath, the soil lit like a vein of magma. Marcus adjusted the gain with careful clicks, narrowing the scale to rule out glare, but the reading held steady. The heat signature wasn't a thin line or a patch. It was a pillar, widening as it went down, as if the grave sat atop a furnace door cracked open. He swallowed. The device recorded internal temperature estimates based on emissivity presets. He calibrated for granite, took another reading, and watched the numbers dance higher than any sun-warmed stone had a right to be in late January. He cut a glance to the grass at the edges. On the screen, the blades fluoresced warm, where the roots drank from heat, then faded to cold at the limits of the plot. The world looked wrong through the camera. Winter painted blue, summer leaking up from one rectangle of ground. A truck door slammed behind him. Marcus lowered the camera and looked back. "Morning," called Tyler, a younger groundsman with restless hands and a cap always turned backwards. Gia and Hank trailed him, blowing on their fingers, their breath pluming and vanishing. "You're out here early," Gia said, tucking a strand of hair into her beanie. "What's the job?" Marcus considered how to answer. If he said it plain, it would sound ridiculous. A grave that glows. A stone that burns. He lifted the camera instead. "Something's off. I want you three to keep clear for a minute." Tyler grinned. "What, did we finally get one of those haunted plots? TikTok would eat it up." "Not funny," Marcus said, sharper than he intended. He sucked in a breath to soften it. "It might be a busted line under here, electrical or gas. I don't know yet, but it's not nothing." Tyler's grin faltered. "We even have lines that run this deep?" "Not from our system," Hank said. He'd been here long enough to remember when the sprinkler network went in, and he wore his experience like a padded vest under his coat. But utilities snake wherever they want. Old town like this, half the maps are guesses. Marcus lifted the camera to his eye again and toggled the palette back to Ironbow for clarity. The grave flared white-hot on the screen, the surrounding snow a smeary charcoal. He wished he could translate the picture to their bare eyes, wished the heat would whisper to them the way it was shouting at him. He held the camera out for Hank. "Look." Hank peered through the eye cup and let out a low whistle. "That's not right." Gia took a turn and sucked her teeth. "Okay, creep factor 10. What are we doing?" Marcus had already made his plan on the walk over. "I'm going to probe around the edges, not the plot itself yet. I want to see if there's any surface cause, a vent, a conduit, something we can see before we start calling strangers and shutting everything down." Tyler's eyebrows went up. "We're digging? In January?" Marcus nodded toward the shed. "Get me the narrow spade and the post hole digger, and the long fiberglass probe." They fetched the tools with the ritual grumbling that accompanied any midwinter dig. Marcus knelt at the border of the plot, away from the headstone and the greenest patch of grass, and pushed the fiberglass probe into the earth. It slid down too easily, the ground below soft as if warmed clay had loosened the winter's grip. He pulled it out. Steam, faint and ghostly, drifted from the hole and vanished into the air. "See that?" Gia whispered. Tyler tried to pass it off as his breath. It wasn't. The scent that rose, a metallic tang with a whisper of ozone, told Marcus exactly what his skin already knew. There was energy down there. Heat, sure, but something else too, something that prickled the hairs along his forearms beneath his coat. He switched the camera to record mode and panned the length of the plot, marking the boundaries with orange flags. The image stayed obscene, a candle flame buried under 6 feet of ground, fed by some invisible wick. "Let's open a shoulder trench," he said, steady now that he had a task. "Just outside the marker line, 2 feet deep to start." They set to work. The first inches broke in noisy plates. After that, the soil turned from brittle to pliable, then to something like damp bread. Marcus worked methodically, carving a clean wall to read the stratification. Frost, loam, then a seam darkened by moisture and heat. As he dug, the smell of warmed earth deepened, joined by a thin electrical whine that seemed to thread up through the handle of his spade. Tyler paused to flex his hands. "I'm not crazy, right? The ground is humming." "You're not crazy," Marcus said. He didn't look up. He didn't want to show them the fear in his eyes. The trench widened, then lengthened along the grave's north edge. 2 feet became 3 to catch the gradient of warmth. Marcus checked with the thermal camera after each foot, mapping invisible borders. Here, safe-ish. There, hotter. Beyond, whiteout. The vibrating undercurrent rose and fell like it was breathing. Hank reached for the post-hole digger. "I can take a core sample right along your line." "Easy," Marcus said. Slow. Metal clinked, dirt thudded onto the tarp, wind rattled dried leaves trapped in the hedges. It might have been any winter maintenance day except for the fact that the air above the trench wavered with a heat shimmer, and, except for the way the sound in the ground continued to throb, bass low, just beneath hearing. At 30 inches, Marcus's spade struck something that wasn't soil. Not the dull thunk of a root or the hollow tap of a coffin lid. He wasn't over the coffin anyway, but a dense, stubborn resistance, as if the blade had nudged a rib of the earth itself. The handle vibrated sharply in his palms. He withdrew, set the spade aside, and brushed with gloved fingers until the outline emerged, a cylinder, broad as a man's forearm, running parallel to the plot. It was coated in something chalky that flaked under touch. Conduit? Gia guessed, breath hitching. Maybe, Hank said, but his voice had lost its earlier certainty. Old. Real old. Marcus pulled off one glove and laid the back of his hand near the cylinder without touching it. Heat radiated up, undeniable. The faint hum sharpened, no longer imagined, not a trick of wind or nerves, but a genuine vibration that tickled the bones of his wrist. He wiped a clear patch with the edge of his glove. Beneath the chalk, the surface showed a dulled sheen. His tongue went dry, insulation that had seen better decades. The kind of thing that, when healthy, you never feel. The kind of thing that, when wounded, lets you know with a warning ache in the air. Tyler crouched closer. So, are we calling this in or back up? Marcus said. Calm was a scaffold he forced himself to climb. All of you, give me a foot, no sudden moves, no metal contacting metal. If they noticed his voice was thinner, they didn't say so. They edged back, boots gritting on frozen tufts. Marcus leaned in, eyes trained on the cylinder, and heard it clearly now, a low, continuous tone like a distant transformer heard through a wall. It thrummed in his teeth. He lifted the thermal camera again and shot the trench, the screen flashing so hot he had to tap the scale down to keep the colors from saturating. The cylinder, if that's what it was, blazed white. The surrounding soil bled orange. A more diffuse shape glowed parallel to it, deeper down and offset, a second run of something, warmer at the junctions. It was enough data for a prudent man to stop. Marcus should have set the camera down and reached for his radio. He should have backed them away and waited for people with clipboards and permits. He knew that. Years of doing the quiet work, the work nobody noticed unless you got it wrong, had taught him when to step aside. But two truths kept him rooted. First, the grave. The heat was focused there more than anywhere along this run. If whatever lay beneath was degrading faster at that point, if it was close to failing, then he had a responsibility to understand how fast the wick was burning. Second, the way towns like Greenhill treated calls from men like him. He could already hear the doubt in some dispatcher's tone, the patient smile of a foreman who'd never set foot in winter soil, telling him it was probably nothing. If he called, he needed to speak with evidence, not with vibes. Marcus, Gia said quietly. Hey, look at me. He did. You don't have to prove this to us, she said. We see it, we do. He nodded once, grateful. Then he went back to the trench. Responsibility one. He would make it quick. He would not touch the cylinder with anything metal. He would expose just enough to see if there was a fracture, if there was a direction to the heat bloom, if the spade he'd set aside slid on the tarp and clinked against the trench lip. The sound, bright metal skimming gritty earth, should have been nothing. But the ground's hum wavered in response, like a beast twitching in its sleep. Marcus froze, every muscle listening. The hum steadied, then grew a notch louder. Back, he said again, voice lower. Tyler, Gia, Hank, step back another 10. Now. They obeyed. He could feel their eyes on him, the trust and the question braided together. Marcus eased himself to his knees, braced his elbows against packed soil, and brushed more dirt from around the cylinder with a plastic trowel. A length emerged, thicker than he'd first guessed, wrapped once in rotted tape. 10 inches further, his trowel clicked against another shape running perpendicular. He carved around it tenderly until a seam showed, a coupling, old and ugly. The hum filled the trench now, a pressure, a presence. The air within the narrow walls wavered, and a thin trickle of moisture crept down the packed dirt face and sizzled in a way that made his stomach drop. There was no flame, but the smell of warmed insulation grew stronger, banded with something sour that soured further the longer he breathed it. Marcus. Tyler again, not a joke in his mouth now. What are we hearing? Power, Marcus said. The word felt inadequate. Enough of it. His radio crackled on his belt, someone at the front gate calling about the fallen branch along the east fence, and the hum under him seemed to answer, a predator snarling at a smaller noise. He clicked the radio off. The hair at the nape of his neck stayed standing. He slid the plastic trowel farther and felt, rather than heard, the change. The vibration deepened from the cylinder's skin into the soil itself, a tremor fanning outward, faint but definite. The packed dirt along the trench face loosened and granulated, sifting in tiny avalanches. The earth had turned from a passive medium into a conductor of feeling. Okay, he said, barely above a whisper, not to them, but to the ground. Okay, I hear you. He reached for the fiberglass probe to test the margin away from the cylinder, an act of measure, not invasion, and as he set the tip against the soil, the hum surged like a wave. It pressed into his chest and rattled his ribs. The trench walls answered with a soft, grinding sound, soil adjusting as if it had exhaled. He could see the shift, cracks spidering along the edges of his careful cut, crumbs skittering onto the tarp. "Marcus!" Gia shouted. "Out!" He should have moved then. He should have let the unknown stay unknown. But a reflex, older than reason, made him glance one last time at the camera screen. The image had gone nearly featureless white where the grave line crossed the run, edges blurring with heat. The numbers in the corner leapt, then dipped, then leapt again. Instability. Not a calm burn. A stutter. The world narrowed to the color on that tiny display and the low animal sound in the earth. He licked his lips, tasted metal, and knew. Out, he repeated hoarsely, but to himself. He shifted his weight to stand, and the shovel he'd left resting against the trench wall slipped. It slid, unhurried, handle first, and struck the exposed cylinder with the faintest kiss of metal on metal. The hum roared like a struck tuning fork the size of a building. The ground under his knees shivered. A clear, undeniable vibration, and a hot gust of air puffed from the seam he'd cleared as if the soil itself had exhaled. Marcus's hand spasmed open. The fiberglass probe dropped and clattered onto the tarp. He grabbed for the trench lip, scrabbling for purchase as the packed dirt sloughed under his boots. Heat licked up in a radiant sheet from the exposed run. He didn't think. He moved. He lunged, catching the grass beyond the trench with his gloved fingers and hauling himself out in one graceless heave. Behind him, the shallow wall shed a few inches of soil with a dry hiss. The hum didn't stop. It intensified, a steady, muscular sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Marcus staggered back, heart pounding, breath opening into great cold drafts that burned his throat. He looked at Tyler, at Gia, at Hank, 3 faces gone pale beneath wool and fleece, and in them he saw the reflection of his own understanding. Whatever lay beneath that grave wasn't a quirk or a prank. It was a wound in the ground, open and angry. The shovel he had knocked free lay half buried in the sliding soil, its blade now warm enough to fog in the freezing air. For a second, the scene held. 4 people, one trembling trench, winter refusing to reclaim a square of earth, and then another tremor rolled underfoot, softer but broader, like a warning rumble before a storm breaks. Marcus's mouth went dry. His hand, still stretched from his scramble, trembled. The thermal camera hanging from its strap thumped once against his chest, and in that thump he felt the choice closing around him. The sound deepened again, and the ground gave a small, undeniable shiver. Marcus's fingers loosened on instinct. The last thing he heard before his breath swallowed everything was the shovel's handle ticking against a stone, the thin note swallowed immediately by the earth's darker chord. And then, in a single startled reflex, his grip failed. The shovel slipped fully from his hand and dropped. The graveyard never sounded so alive. What should have been silence, snow settling, branches creaking, was drowned by the low, unnatural hum that rose from the earth. Marcus stood just beyond the trench, his chest heaving, the thermal camera knocking against his coat with each heartbeat. The sound deepened, as if the ground itself were a throat carrying a buried growl. Tyler, Gia, and Hank stared at him, faces pale, waiting for a cue. The hum intensified again, vibrating in the soles of their boots. That was the moment Marcus understood. This wasn't just an anomaly. It was an emergency. Something down there was wrong on a scale he couldn't control. "Everybody out," Marcus barked, his voice cracking through the wind. "Now, evacuate the grounds." Tyler blinked at him. "What? It's just—" "Go," Marcus shouted with a force that made his own throat sting. "Move!" They didn't need further convincing. Gia grabbed Tyler's sleeve, and Hank was already turning, boots skidding in the snow as they sprinted toward the gates. Marcus backed away, never turning his back to the trench. The hum had become a steady vibration, as if the soil itself was wired to a power source it was never meant to hold. The air shimmered above the grave, a distortion like heat waves rising off asphalt in summer. Marcus raised the thermal camera one last time. The display nearly blinded him, an expanding bloom of white-hot energy bleeding across the plot. The numbers jumped erratically, impossible to stabilize. Whatever ran beneath that grave was faltering, stuttering, like a dying beast fighting its last breath. He cursed under his breath and ran. Snow crunched as he followed the others, adrenaline burning away the cold. At the gate, his crew huddled, eyes wide, lungs wheezing from the sudden sprint. Gia spoke first, her voice trembling. "Marcus, what the hell is under there?" Marcus wiped a shaking hand over his mouth, staring back at the distant grave. Even from here, he could see the faint shimmer of warm air rising, defying the winter chill. "Power," he said flatly, "enough to take us all with it if we stay." They didn't argue. Minutes later, the blare of sirens cut through the cemetery's hush. Red and blue lights smeared against the snow as emergency utility trucks rolled up, their tires crunching the frozen ground. Men in reflective jackets spilled out, carrying heavy cases, their breath steaming. "What's the call?" one demanded, approaching Marcus. Marcus pointed towards the grave. "Under that plot. Something's burning down there. Power, gas, I don't know, but it's unstable. I've seen the readings." Skepticism flickered in the man's eyes, but it vanished when Marcus thrust the thermal camera into his hands. The man looked, squinted, then cursed under his breath. "Get a trench crew," he shouted to his team. "Now!" They worked fast. Soil flew in frantic bursts as insulated tools dug down, the sound of spades clanking against frozen earth. Marcus stood back, his crew at his side, watching. Every few moments the ground trembled underfoot, subtle but unmistakable, like a warning pulse. Then came the shout. "Stop digging! "We've got contact." Flashlights cut across the trench. Utility workers crouched, their gloved hands brushing away soil to reveal the corroded skin of a high-voltage line, thick as a man's arm, its insulation peeling like old bark. Blue sparks whispered from the metal, fizzing into the air. And, just inches below, another line, this one a gas pipe, ran parallel. The realization spread like frost over glass. One worker swore violently. Another shouted into a radio, calling for immediate lockdown. The air in the trench shimmered with invisible heat, and the faint hiss of gas seeped upward like a whisper of doom. Marcus's jaw tightened. His instincts had been right. The grave wasn't just strange. It was a bomb waiting to ignite. The lead foreman climbed out of the trench, face pale beneath his helmet. He pulled off his gloves, wiping sweat from his brow despite the frigid air. His eyes met Marcus's. "You did the right thing getting people out," he said, his voice steady but grim. "If this had gone off—" He didn't finish. He didn't need to. Behind them, the hum persisted, a low reminder that the danger hadn't passed yet. Workers scrambled, setting up barriers, hauling in containment gear, shouting over radios. Floodlights flared to life, washing the graveyard in harsh white light. Marcus watched, his chest still tight, his pulse still loud in his ears. He thought of how close he had come to brushing the cable with his spade, of how thin the line was between caution and catastrophe. The warmth he had felt through the granite marker wasn't some ghost story. It was a warning, one he had barely heeded in time. He turned to his crew, their faces drawn. "Stay back. Stay safe. Let them do their work." Tyler swallowed hard. "If you hadn't noticed—" Marcus cut him off gently. "Don't finish that sentence." The night settled heavy over Green Hill Cemetery as the emergency crews fought to contain the beast buried under its soil. Marcus stood at the gate, the snow crunching beneath his boots, and realized just how fragile the line was between silence and destruction. And the grave still hummed. The graveyard was transformed. Where winter had cloaked it in silence, now it was a hive of frantic movement. Floodlights turned snow into glare, long shadows of tombstones stretching across the ground like the arms of restless spirits. Utility crews barked orders, their boots pounding through slush, their gloved hands wrestling cables, detectors, and clamps. The once quiet cemetery buzzed with generators, radios, and the hum of heavy machinery. Marcus Johnson stood at the gate, coat zipped tight, watching the storm unfold. His crew huddled nearby, silent and shaken. They had all seen the truth beneath the soil. The fractured line of high-voltage power, the fragile gas pipes running alongside. A perfect recipe for disaster. The thought churned in Marcus's mind. If he hadn't touched that stone, if he hadn't trusted his instincts, they would all be standing above a crater instead of cold earth. The foreman approached him again, his helmet tilted back, his face creased with sweat. "We're shutting it down section by section," he said. His voice was low, weighted. "It's worse than we thought. The insulation's gone in more than one place. And the gas lines, they're stressed, real stressed." Marcus only nodded. His throat felt raw from shouting earlier, his body heavy from the adrenaline crash. "How close was it?" he asked finally. The man hesitated, then answered with brutal honesty. "Close enough. One spark, one fracture in the wrong spot, and the whole place would have lit up. We're talking a blast strong enough to flatten half this cemetery, maybe take out the houses along the south wall, too." The words sank into Marcus like lead. He turned to look at the grave again. The air above it still rippled faintly, the lingering heat shimmering like a mirage. Families came here to grieve, to find peace, never realizing they stood on a powder keg. Behind him, Gia's voice broke the silence. "Nobody's gonna believe this." Tyler let out a bitter laugh. "Yeah, they'll write it off as some freak equipment failure. No one's gonna talk about who saw it first." Marcus said nothing. He didn't do this for credit, but a small part of him wondered, would anyone care that it was him, the quiet black groundskeeper, who had saved their lives? For years, people had walked past him without seeing him, without noticing the man who trimmed the grass around their loved ones' graves or shoveled snow so their feet wouldn't slip. The foreman clapped him on the shoulder. "You kept your head. You moved fast. You saved people, Johnson. Don't forget that." The words should have been enough, but Marcus knew how stories traveled in a town like this. By morning, the news would mention the utility crews, the city's quick response, maybe a line about alert maintenance staff. But his name, his face, the man who felt the heat and made the call, he'd be erased, folded back into silence. Still, as the hours wore on and the danger subsided, Marcus stayed by the gate. He watched as crews sealed the lines, as sparks died, as the hum beneath the grave finally faded into silence. The air cooled, and for the first time in days, the grass around the headstone began to frost over, surrendering to winter. Dawn crept pale across the horizon. The cemetery was quiet again, though now scarred by trenches, cones, and tape. Marcus's crew had gone home, exhausted, but he remained. He walked slowly to the grave that had started it all. His boots crunched through the snow until he stood before the granite marker of Daniel Moore. He pressed his hand against the stone. This time it was cold, lifeless as it should be. He let out a long breath, one he hadn't realized he was holding. In the stillness, he thought about what it meant to be overlooked, to live in the margins of other people's awareness. He had stopped a catastrophe, but by nightfall the world would forget. He wasn't a firefighter or a police officer or a politician. He was just the man who cared for the dead. And yet, if the cemetery still stood, if families could still visit their loved ones without fear, it was because of him. He straightened, pulling his coat tighter. Recognition didn't matter. What mattered was that he had done what needed to be done, when no one else saw the danger. Marcus turned toward the gate, the pale morning stretching across Green Hill Cemetery. He paused once, looking back at the rows of graves. The silence was whole again, restored. But as he walked away, a thought lingered, cold and sharp as the air in his lungs. The warmth had vanished today, but what if, one winter morning, it returned? The danger was stopped, but the mystery still lingers. What would you do in his place? Share your thoughts below, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more stories.